The nation's third botched execution in 6 months has rekindled the debate over the death penalty. Arizona inmate Joseph Rudolph Wood was pronounced dead at 6:49 p.m. yesterday, 1 hour and 57 minutes after the execution began. Witnesses report him gasping for 90 minutes. The execution took so long that his lawyers had time to file an emergency appeal while it was happening. The Arizona Supreme Court also called an impromptu hearing on the matter and learned of his death during the discussions. It is the third execution gone awry this year in the U.S., including one in Ohio, in which an inmate gasped in similar fashion for nearly a half hour. Oklahoma inmate Clayton Lockett died of a heart attack in April, minutes after prison officials halted his execution because the drugs weren't being administered properly. I was joined earlier by Alexander Simpson from the California Innocence Project and an adjunct professor at the California Western School of Law to talk about how this incident could potentially hand new evidence to those building a case against lethal injections. I first asked him what we know so far about the drugs used in yesterday's execution.
So the drugs that are used in this particular case, there's 4 states that have really tried to have to scramble to continue the pace of executions after the traditional drugs that were used are now kind of put to the wayside. So this is a cocktail of drugs that is really by definition experimental. There aren't really any kind of track records about how these drugs are used, especially with regards to lethal injection. And so this is a new cocktail of drugs that obviously did not work out at all in these last few executions.
Why are the drugs such a secret? You know, a lot of pharmacies who put these drugs together, they don't want to be identified, at least the mixing pharmacies. The pharmaceutical companies don't want to be identified. You know, why is it so important that these people allowed to keep this a secret?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The particular drugs, the knowledge about the drugs and where they come from really just comes down to if the opponents of the death penalty know where the drugs are coming from, then that is where the focus of the opposition becomes. Obviously, the reason why we don't use the drugs that we previously used in the United States, or at least with the frequency that we did, is because those drug companies have made have taken positions that they won't sell to correctional institutions or correctional organizations anymore because they're going to be used for executions. So as soon as the general public and primarily the opposition to the death penalty finds out what particular drugs are being used, then that becomes the petition to try to get those drug companies to also refuse to sell to correctional systems to try to stop the death penalty that way.
Now, what could be causing these delays when using the lethal injection? Isn't the procedure only supposed to take about 10 minutes?
Yes, it is supposed to take 10 minutes, or at least that was with the prior cocktail, which was primarily a phenobarbital. It was an average of about 10 minutes or less. It's actually a very interesting point that what we're really talking about is lethal injection was originally sold as a humane alternative or a humane process for carrying out the death penalty. And it's now become, with these latest round of botched executions, it's now become actually so unpalatable to people that even prisoners are asking for their executions to be carried out through hanging or through firing squad. That's how inhumane the process has now become.
Now, Wood's attorney, his team of attorneys actually tried to plead to the courts to halt the execution after they saw him in the midst of suffering. They were unsuccessful, but is that even legally possible?
Well, obviously, when you're talking about the death penalty, one of the things that you have to get around is that any type of challenge to the death penalty primarily centers around the idea that it's a cruel and unusual punishment. And lethal injection was not necessarily conceived as cruel or unusual because it doesn't take that long and because it's primarily kind of puts the person to sleep and then shuts down the systems. If you're talking about somebody who's writhing in pain for 2 hours, at a certain point, it becomes cruel and unusual, and therefore it's a violation of the person's rights. Even if they're executed, they have to be done in a way that doesn't violate their constitutional rights.
Governor Brewer has called for an investigation into this. What could come of that?
Yeah, that is a good question. What is the ultimate goal of any particular investigation into this? I think the proponents of the death penalty are trying to make sure that whatever executions happen with this cocktail or with another cocktail down the road, that it becomes something like what we used to have. And the opponents of the death penalty would most likely say that any investigation is really just going to turn up that this is no longer an acceptable alternative to the prior lethal injection process. So I think any kind of investigation may turn up that the procedure was handled improperly or that the drugs were administered improperly. But it's most likely going to center around just the debate of whether or not we want to have a death penalty or whether we think it's a good idea.
Arizona, Ohio, Oklahoma, and on into the future, possibly. States with botched executions via, lethal injections. A California judge even recently stayed another lethal injection due to his finding that the death penalty sentence itself is currently qualified as cruel and unusual punishment under the Constitution. Do incidents like yesterday's just energize people's desire to fight this through the courts and not the legislature?
That's correct, yeah. Traditionally, the fight against the death penalty has been more legislative in nature, that people want to try to get the death penalty voted off of the books. But increasingly, courts have recognized that, that the death penalty can be both cruel and unusual, even if you're talking about a perfect execution. In California, for example, one of the reasons why the judge said that this was a violation of anyone's constitutional rights is that it's so arbitrarily carried out that it often takes decades for somebody, after they've been sentenced to death, to be executed. And so I think what you'll be seeing more of is more challenges through the courts, that this process is just simply broken.
All right, Alexander Simpson from the California Innocence Project and an adjunct professor at the California Western School of Law. Thank you very much.
Thank you.